What if the boy everyone laughed at became the one man an entire family would one day beg for mercy from? What if the child forced to eat rotten leftovers, insects crawling through his plate, grew up to own more wealth than the people who starved him could ever imagine? This is not a fairy tale. This is the story of a boy named Leon. A boy nobody wanted, a boy who was broken down every single day of his life, and yet somehow, impossibly, rose from nothing into a $20 billion empire. Stay with me till the end, because what Leon does when he finally returns home will leave you speechless. Leon never knew the sound of his mother's voice. She died just days after bringing him into the world, her body too weak from complications during childbirth to recover. Leon was raised on stories, fragments really, pieced together from an aunt here, a neighbor there. They said she had kind eyes. They said she sang before she passed. But Leon never got to hear it. He grew up chasing a memory that was never really his to keep. His father tried. God knows he tried. A quiet, hard-working man who took on double shifts at a warehouse just to keep food on the table, and Leon in a decent pair of shoes for school. He wasn't rich. He wasn't even comfortable. But he was present, and for a boy who had already lost one parent, presence meant everything. Then, when Leon was 14 years old, his father collapsed at work, a heart condition nobody had caught in time. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was already too late. In the space of one afternoon, Leon became an orphan. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a child who has just lost everything. Not sadness exactly. Sadness would come later, in waves, at strange hours of the night. In that first moment, there was only silence. Leon sat in the hospital corridor in his school uniform, still clutching a homework assignment he had been planning to show his father, and he understood, somewhere deep in his chest, that his whole world had just ended. He had no other family, no grandparents left, no aunts or uncles willing to step forward, except one. His father had remarried briefly, years earlier, to a woman who left before Leon turned 10, but her family, his stepmother's relatives, still lived in the same town. And out of some mixture of obligation and public appearance, they agreed to take him in. Reluctantly doesn't begin to describe it. From the very first night, Leon understood that he was not welcome. He was tolerated. There is a difference, and children, even 14-year-old boys still numb with grief, can feel that difference in their bones. The house was large, comfortable, warm in the way houses are when the people inside them have never known hunger or fear. But none of that comfort was extended to Leon. He was given a small room at the back, near the laundry area, with a mattress that had clearly seen better decades. And from day one, the rules of his new life were made brutally clear. He ate last. Always last. Every evening, the family would sit at the long dining table. The stepmother, her two biological children, a boy and a girl, both a little older than Leon, and whichever relatives happened to be visiting that week. They would eat, laugh, talk about their days, while Leon stood by the kitchen doorway, waiting. Not invited to sit, not invited to speak, just waiting. Only after everyone had finished, after plates were cleared and the family had disappeared into the living room to watch television, was Leon allowed to eat whatever remained. And remained is a generous word. Sometimes there was nothing left but scraps. Cold rice hardening at the edges, bones picked clean. Vegetables gone soggy and gray from sitting out for hours in the humid evening air. Leon's step-siblings knew this, and they made a game of it, deliberately leaving food out longer than necessary, sometimes uncovering pots on purpose so that flies would find their way in before Leon ever got the chance. More than once, Leon lifted a spoon to his mouth only to see something moving in the plate. Insects, drawn by the heat and the neglect, crawling through what was supposed to be his dinner. He would pick them out with trembling fingers because the alternative, an empty stomach until morning, was worse. Hunger, it turned out, does not care about dignity. Hunger makes a boy eat things a boy should never have to eat, and pretend it doesn't bother him, because there is no one there to comfort him if it does. His days began before sunrise. While the rest of the household slept, Leon was up sweeping floors, washing the previous night's dishes, scrubbing bathrooms, hauling water when the pipes acted up, which they often did in that neighborhood. Only once every corner of that house gleamed was he allowed to change into his school uniform. The same worn shirt and trousers, and walked the 2 miles to school because there was no money set aside for his transport, and no one offered any. At school, for a few hours a day, Leon found something resembling peace. Not friendship exactly. The other students knew about his situation, and children can be cruel in their own casual way, whispering about the boy who lives with people who aren't really his family. But in the classroom, something in Leon came alive. Numbers made sense to him. Words organized themselves clearly in his mind. For those few hours, nobody made him feel small. Then the final bell would ring and he would walk home to more chores. Floors again. Laundry again. Whatever his step-siblings decided he should do, because by then, even they had started giving him orders. Delighting in ordering around a boy who had no choice but to obey. And it was around this time that a particular cruelty took root, one that would follow Leon for years. His step-siblings began stealing his homework. At first it seemed almost incidental. An assignment would go missing from his bag, and Leon would arrive at school without it. Forced to explain to a teacher who had no patience for excuses. He would receive detention, sometimes worse. But then it happened again, and again. And Leon began to notice something chilling. Every time it happened, his step-siblings would exchange a look, a smirk, a barely suppressed laugh. They weren't just stealing his homework. They were destroying it, burning pages in the backyard incinerator, or simply throwing them into the gutter on their way to school, just to watch Leon suffer the consequences. And when the punishments came, the detentions, the scoldings, the notes sent home that nobody at home cared to read, his step-siblings celebrated, openly, as though Leon's suffering was entertainment, a show performed nightly for their amusement. Leon told no one. Who was there to tell? The woman who had taken him in made it clear, through silence and distance, that his problems were his own to bear. Complaining would only make things worse. So Leon learned, very young, to carry his pain alone, to fold it up small and tuck it somewhere deep inside himself, and to keep moving forward. And somehow, despite everything, the hunger, the exhaustion, the humiliation, the sabotage, Leon did not break. If anything, he sharpened. There was a particular kind of fire that burns in a child who has been told, in 1,000 small, cruel ways, that he does not matter. Some children let that fire consume them, curdle into bitterness, into rage, into giving up entirely. But in Leon, that same fire became fuel. Every stolen assignment he rewrote from memory, staying up long after the house had gone quiet. Working by the thin light of a phone screen because his room had no working lamp. Every insult he absorbed and turned into a private burning determination. He decided, somewhere around his 15th birthday, sitting alone in that back room with a stomach full of nothing, that he would not simply survive this house. He would outgrow it. He would become someone so undeniable, so impossible to overlook, that the people currently laughing at him would one day have no choice but to see him. He didn't know yet what that would look like. He was 15, hungry, and utterly alone in a house full of people. But the decision itself, quiet, private, unspoken, was the first brick in a foundation that would one day support an empire. By 16, Leon was the top student in every subject he took. And he had started doing something few people knew about. He was reading everything he could get his hands on about business, about money, about the mechanics of how wealth was built and passed down and multiplied. Not because anyone encouraged him to. Because the local library was warm and quiet and free, and it was the one place in his life where nobody could steal anything from him. He would sit there for hours after school before returning home to his chores, devouring biographies of self-made entrepreneurs, dog-earing pages about real estate and investment strategy, teaching himself concepts that wouldn't appear in his school curriculum for years, if ever. It became his secret. His step-siblings could steal his homework. They could steal his food. They could not steal the knowledge quietly accumulating in his mind, page by page, night after night. At 17, everything came to a head. Graduation season arrived, and the school announced its results for the year, and Leon's name sat at the very top. Not just top of his class, top of the entire school. the highest academic record the institution had produced in years. Teachers who had watched this quiet, hollow-eyed boy for years, who had punished him unfairly for homework he never actually failed to complete, now found themselves reading his name aloud at an assembly, unable to reconcile the boy they thought they knew with the results in front of them. Leon should have gone home to celebration that day, to pride, to someone, an order, telling him well done. Instead, he walked through the front door of that house clutching his certificate, and was met with silence, and then laughter, and then a single sentence from his stepmother that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Being the smartest boy in a school doesn't mean anything if you're still the poorest boy in this house. His step-siblings roared with laughter. And that night, Leon ate leftovers alone, in the dark, exactly as he had 1,000 nights before. But something was different this time. As he sat there in that same small room staring at a certificate that proved, undeniably, what he was capable of, Leon made himself a quiet promise. One day he would come back to this house, and when he did, no one would be laughing but him. Result: the morning after graduation, Leon woke up before sunrise, exactly as he always did. He swept the floors. He washed the dishes from the night before. He did not complain, and he did not cry. Something in him had shifted the previous night, quietly and permanently, and it showed in the way he moved through his chores that morning, not with the same tired resignation as before, but with the calm efficiency of someone who already knew this chapter of his life was closing, even if the walls around him hadn't noticed yet. He had one advantage that nobody in that house understood, and it was this: while they had spent years underestimating him, Leon had spent years preparing. The books he'd devoured in the library, the concepts of compound interest, market cycles, property valuation, and business structuring that he'd taught himself in stolen hours after chores were done. None of it had been visible to the people around him, because none of them had ever bothered to ask. What Leon did with his time, they saw as servant. They never once considered that the servant was studying them, studying the world, quietly building a blueprint in his mind for an entirely different kind of life. At 18, Leon received something he had never expected: a full scholarship to study business administration at a respected university 200 miles from the town. That had defined his entire childhood. His grades had done what nothing else in his life could do. They had opened a door, and Leon walked through it without looking back. The day he left that house for the last time, nobody drove him to the bus station. Nobody helped him pack his single bag of belongings. His step-siblings didn't even bother to say goodbye. They had long since moved on from tormenting him to simply ignoring him, which in its own way was almost a relief. His stepmother stood in the doorway as he left, arms folded, and said only one thing: "Don't expect anything from us if this doesn't work out." Leon didn't respond. He didn't need to. He simply picked up his bag, walked to the end of the road, and boarded a bus toward a future none of them believed he had. University life was not glamorous. Leon arrived with almost nothing. A scholarship covered his tuition, but not his living expenses. And for the first 2 years, he worked nights at a campus dining hall, clearing trays and mopping floors, in a strange echo of the servitude he thought he'd left behind. But there was a critical difference now. This labor was his choice, done in service of his own future, and every exhausted hour felt like an investment rather than a punishment. He studied with a hunger that unsettled even his professors. Where other students crammed the night before an exam, Leon had already read 3 chapters ahead. Where classmates complained about assignments, Leon treated every paper as an opportunity to sharpen ideas he intended to use one day, for real, with real money on the line. His professors began to notice him, not just as a bright student, but as someone unusually serious about applying what he learned. One economics professor, a woman named Dr. Adaze Whitfield, took a particular interest in him after reading a paper he'd written on undervalued urban property markets. She became something Leon had never really had before, a mentor who believed in him without needing convincing. "You don't write like a student," she told him once after class. "You write like someone who already knows he's going to build something." Leon graduated with the highest honors in his cohort, and instead of taking the first stable job offer that came his way, a comfortable position at a mid-sized accounting firm that would have paid well and asked little of him, he made a decision that shocked everyone who thought they understood him. He turned it down and enrolled directly into a PhD program in business management, determined to master not just the practice, but the deep theory behind wealth creation, market behavior, and organizational strategy. Those years were brutal in a different way than his childhood had been. Not cruel, but relentless. Research deadlines, teaching assistant duties to fund his living costs. Nights that stretched into mornings, fueled by instant coffee and a stubborn refusal to fail. But Leon had learned something from his childhood that no textbook could teach him. He knew, on a cellular level, what it felt like to have nothing. And that knowledge became his greatest asset. While his peers theorized about scarcity and hardship in the abstract, Leon understood it as lived truth, and that understanding shaped every business model he designed, every strategy he built. By 23, Leon held his PhD, Dr. Leon, a title that, for a boy who once ate insect-ridden leftovers in a dark back room, felt almost surreal to hear spoken aloud. But a title alone does not build an empire. What came next was years of grinding, invisible work that nobody watching from the outside would have called glamorous. Leon started small, smaller than most people would expect from a man who would one day be worth $20 billion. He took a modest position at a regional real estate investment firm. Not because it paid particularly well, but because he had identified, through years of self-directed research, that real estate was the single most reliable engine of generational wealth, provided you understood the market cycles better than everyone else in the room. And Leon did. He spent his first 2 years at the firm absorbing everything: how deals were structured, how properties were valued, how developers convinced banks to finance ambitious projects, how neighborhoods rose and fell in value based on patterns most people never bothered to study. He saved almost everything he earned, living far below his means in a small rented room not unlike the one he'd grown up in. Except this time, the deprivation was a choice, a deliberate sacrifice in service of a larger plan. His first independent investment was modest, a small, run-down duplex in a neighborhood everyone else considered a lost cause. Leon saw something different. He saw a transit expansion project quietly moving through city planning committees. One that would, within 3 years, dramatically increase foot traffic and property values in that exact area. He bought the duplex with almost every dollar he had saved, renovated it himself on weekends to save on labor costs, and rented it out. 18 months later, he sold it for nearly 4 times what he'd paid. That single deal became the seed of everything that followed. Leon reinvested every dollar of profit into a second property, then a third, then a small apartment complex, methodically building a portfolio while working full-time, sleeping 4 hours a night and refusing every single luxury that might have slowed his momentum. Where other young professionals spent their bonuses on new cars or vacations, Leon poured his into due diligence reports, zoning research, and land his instincts told him would matter later, even when nobody else could see why. By the time Leon turned 30, he had left the firm entirely and founded his own real estate investment company, built on a simple but powerful thesis: identify undervalued communities before the rest of the market catches on. Invest early, develop responsibly, and hold for the long term. It was not a flashy strategy. It did not make headlines overnight. But it was relentlessly, mathematically sound, and Leon executed it with a discipline that bordered on obsession. Word began to spread. Investors who had watched his early returns wanted in. Banks that had once hesitated to finance an unknown young founder began competing for his business. Leon's company grew from a handful of properties to dozens, then hundreds, expanding across multiple cities, then multiple states, then internationally, as his reputation for spotting overlooked opportunities became something close to legendary within investment circles. Result: he built with intention. Unlike some developers who prioritized speed and profit above all else, Leon insisted on community-conscious development, renovating rather than displacing, creating housing that people could actually afford, while still generating strong returns for his investors. It was, in some ways, a quiet rebellion against everything he had experienced as a child. A business built on the principle that people deserved dignity, that no one should have to feel invisible or discarded, that the most vulnerable communities were worth investing in rather than exploiting. By his late 30s, Leon's company had become one of the most respected real estate empires in the country. Skyscrapers bearing his company's name rose in city skylines. Affordable housing developments he had championed transformed entire neighborhoods, lifting property values while keeping working families in their homes, rather than pricing them out. Business magazines that once wouldn't have looked twice at him now competed to feature him on their covers. Fascinated by a founder who had built such staggering wealth while remaining almost mysteriously private about his personal history. Because Leon never talked about his childhood. Not publicly, not to reporters, not to business partners, not even to most of his closest colleagues. The house, the insects in his food, the stolen homework, the nights of quiet hunger. He carried all of it privately, a locked room in the back of his mind that he visited alone. On the rare nights when sleep wouldn't come. By the time Leon turned 45, independent valuations placed his real estate empire at over $20 billion. He owned residential towers, commercial complexes, entire master-planned communities across multiple continents. He employed thousands of people. He sat on philanthropic boards, quietly funding scholarship programs for orphaned and displaced children, a cause he never publicly explained the reason behind, though anyone who knew his story could have guessed. And yet, despite everything he had built, despite the wealth, the influence, the respect of an entire industry, there remained one chapter of Leon's life that had never truly closed. One house, one family, one promise made in the dark by a hungry, humiliated 17-year-old boy that he had never forgotten. One evening, sitting alone in the penthouse office of the very tower that bore his name, Leon opened an old, worn folder he'd kept hidden for decades, his original high school diploma, the same one his stepmother had once dismissed. With a single cruel sentence, he read the date. He calculated how many years it had been, and he picked up his phone and made a call to his driver. "Prepare the car," he said quietly, "and bring me the clothes from the storage box. The old ones. It was time to go home." The car ride took longer than Leon remembered. It wasn't the distance. Modern highways had cut what used to be a 4-hour bus journey down to under 2. It was something else. Something about watching the landscape change outside the tinted windows, watching the city give way to smaller towns, watching the familiar shape of hills he hadn't seen in nearly 3 decades rise up on the horizon. That made the drive feel endless. Leon sat in the back of an unremarkable sedan, not the Range Rover, not yet, dressed exactly as he had asked. Old faded trousers, a shirt with a small tear near the collar, one he had specifically kept in storage for this exact purpose. Worn shoes, the leather cracked at the toe. He had not worn clothes like this in over 20 years, and yet putting them on that morning had felt disturbingly natural, like slipping back into a version of himself he had never fully left behind. His driver, a quiet, loyal man named Marcus who had worked for Leon for nearly a decade, glanced at him in the rearview mirror more than once during the drive, clearly curious but too professional to ask questions. Leon offered no explanation. He simply stared out the window, watching the town of his childhood rebuild itself in his memory. Street by street, as they got closer, the house looked smaller than he remembered. That was the first thing that struck him as the car pulled up outside. Not the emotional weight he had braced himself for, not a flood of memories, but simply the strange, almost comical realization that the house which had once felt like the entire world, an inescapable fortress of cruelty and control, was, in reality, just a modest 2-story home with peeling paint and an overgrown front lawn. Smaller, older, diminished by time in a way that Leon somehow had not been. He asked Marcus to park a block away and wait. This part he needed to walk. Leon approached the front gate slowly, deliberately, taking in details his younger self would have been too afraid to notice. The same cracked pathway leading to the front door. The same window of the room that used to be his, the one near the laundry area. Still with the same thin curtains, now faded almost to gray. A porch that had once seemed enormous now looked barely large enough to hold a small table and 2 chairs. He knocked. It took nearly a full minute before the door opened, and when it did, Leon found himself face to face with his stepmother. Older now, gray-haired, moving slower than he remembered, squinting at him with the particular suspicion people reserve for strangers who show up looking like they might be asking for money. She did not recognize him. Not at first. Why would she? 28 years had passed, and standing in front of her was a man dressed like someone who had fallen on hard times. A far cry from the polished, camera-ready businessman occasionally profiled in magazines she never read. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone already carrying the edge of someone preparing to turn a stranger away. "It's Leon," he said simply. The silence that followed stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Recognition moved slowly across her face. First confusion, then disbelief, then something Leon couldn't quite name. Somewhere between shock and calculation. "Leon," she repeated, as though testing whether the name still meant what it used to. Behind her, drawn by the commotion, his step-siblings appeared in the doorway, no longer the teenagers who had once stolen his homework and laughed at his punishments, but middle-aged now, softened and worn by years neither had used particularly well. Leon recognized them instantly, despite everything time had changed. Some things, apparently, don't fade. The particular curl of a smirk, the way his stepbrother's eyes narrowed with the same old contempt, even after almost 3 decades. "Well, look who decided to come crawling back," his stepbrother said, folding his arms, already sliding into the familiar rhythm of old cruelty as though no time had passed at all. "Life didn't work out so well for the golden boy, huh?" His stepsister laughed, the exact same laugh Leon remembered from childhood, sharp and delighted at his expense. "Look at him. Look at those clothes. I told you he'd end up just like this." Leon said nothing. He simply stood there, absorbing it, letting the old cruelty wash over him one final time, almost curious to see if it could still touch the parts of him that used to ache under its weight. And what he discovered, standing on that porch in his worn shoes, was something quietly profound. It couldn't. Not anymore. The words landed and simply dissolved, without finding anywhere to take root. "I came to see the old house," Leon said finally, his voice calm, almost gentle. "I wanted to see where I grew up, one more time." His stepmother's expression shifted slightly, something almost like caution flickering behind her eyes, though she quickly covered it. "Well, you can see it's still standing," she said. "It's not that it did much for you." "No," Leon agreed quietly. "It didn't do much for me." There was a pause. And then, almost predictably, the old dynamic reasserted itself, his step-siblings exchanging a look Leon recognized instantly. The same silent communication they'd once used before stealing his homework or leaving his food out to spoil. It was his stepbrother who spoke first. "So what, you need somewhere to stay? Is that why you're here?" "Because things aren't exactly," he gestured vaguely at Leon's clothes, "looking great for you." Leon almost smiled. "Almost." "No," he said, "I don't need anywhere to stay. I have somewhere to be, actually. I just wanted to come back one last time before I went there." He turned then, without waiting for a response, and began walking back down the cracked pathway toward the gate. Behind him, he heard his step-siblings' laughter start up again, already turning the moment into a story they would probably tell for weeks. The once promising Leon, reduced to rags, showing up at their door like a beggar looking for scraps. Leon reached the gate just as the sound of an engine grew louder down the street. The Range Rover rounded the corner exactly on schedule, polished black, gleaming under the afternoon sun, moving with the unmistakable weight and presence of genuine wealth. It slowed as it approached the house, and the laughter behind Leon abruptly died into confused silence. The vehicle came to a stop directly in front of the gate. Marcus stepped out first, dressed in an immaculate dark suit, and moved swiftly around to open the rear door with practiced precision. A second man, Leon's personal assistant, carrying a slim leather folder, stepped out and approached Leon directly, disregarding the stunned family still frozen in the doorway. "Mr. Leon," the assistant said, his tone entirely professional, entirely respectful, in stark contrast to everything that had just been said on that porch. "The transfer has been finalized, as you requested. Here is the confirmation, along with the letter." He handed Leon a sealed envelope. Leon turned back toward the house. His stepmother's mouth had fallen slightly open. His step-siblings stood utterly still, the laughter gone from their faces entirely. replaced by something closer to dawning, horrified understanding. Leon walked back up the pathway one final time and held the envelope out toward his stepmother. "This is for you," he said, "all of you. $5 million split however you see fit." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. "There's a letter inside," Leon continued, his voice steady, without a trace of bitterness. "It explains everything. But I'll tell you now so you don't have to wonder while you read it. It's a thank you for giving me a roof all those years ago when I had absolutely nowhere else to go. I know it wasn't easy, having a stranger's child forced into your home. I know none of you asked for that responsibility, so thank you. That's all this is." His stepmother's hands trembled as she finally reached out and took the envelope, staring at it as though it might dissolve if she looked away. "Leon, she started, but he raised a hand gently, not unkindly, simply enough to stop her. "You don't need to say anything," he said. "I'm not here for an apology. I'm not here for revenge either, in case that's what you were bracing for. I just wanted to close this chapter properly, on my own terms." He turned then and walked back toward the Range Rover, his worn shoes scuffing against the same cracked pavement he had walked to school on, barefoot in spirit, if not in fact, for years of his childhood. Marcus held the door open, and Leon slid into the back seat without looking back. As the vehicle pulled away, smooth and silent, Leon caught one final glimpse in the side mirror, his stepmother still standing frozen on the porch, envelope clutched to her chest, his step-sibling staring after the retreating car with expressions caught somewhere between shame and disbelief. Leon exhaled slowly and allowed himself, finally, a small, genuine smile. He hadn't returned for their apology. He hadn't returned for revenge or triumph or even closure in the way most people imagined it. He had returned simply to prove something to himself, that the boy who once ate insect-ridden leftovers in a dark back room, who had every reason in the world to become bitter, hollow, broken, had instead become someone capable of walking back into the house that tried to break him and choosing grace anyway. Because that, in the end, was the real inheritance of his childhood. Not the wealth, not the empire, but the quiet, hard-won understanding that success was never about proving people wrong. It was about becoming someone who no longer needed to. As the Range Rover merged onto the highway, leaving the small town behind for what Leon suspected would be the final time, he looked out at the horizon and thought, briefly, of the 17-year-old boy who had once made a promise in the dark. That promise was kept, not with anger, not with spite, but with $5 million, a quiet drive away, and a peace that no amount of cruelty had ever managed to take from him.